Hello friends and followers, welcome back to Phoenix Studios. I'm Phoenix. Thank you for tuning in to the 5th video in a 10-part series on drawing for beginners. Today we are going to be putting all of our knowledge from the previous videos to use. We will be turning a 2-dimensional shape of a square into a 3-dimensional cube. Remember to be patient with your drawing. These techniques do take time and a lot of practice to grasp. For now, we are not going to get into perspective and vanishing points. That will be covered in future videos. But we are going to discuss how light works and how it affects our subject matter. Understanding how light works is necessary for us in order to apply proper values of shading to our subject matter. Now, as you can see here, I'm using an HB pencil and I'm just very lightly roughing in the outline of the object. I'm using very light pressure here, just putting in a rough outline. Previously to starting the drawing of the shape of the square and then the cube, you'll notice I did do a value scale. This is a good practice and habit to get into. It helps warm you up for the drawing you're about to do, and it refreshes your mind on those different tones and values that you want to incorporate in your sketches and your drawings. You can refer back to your value scale throughout the drawing and make sure that you're incorporating all of those different tones into your drawing. Now, if your drawing does have all of those different values from 1 through 8, you should have an overall balanced drawing, and it will create those effects that you're desiring. Now, here what I'm doing is I've decided where my light source is coming from. I didn't draw it in here, but it's coming from the upper right, just off the corner of that 8th rectangle on the value scale. So the light source is up in that general area. Due to the fact that my light source is up there, I wanted to determine where my area in the cast shadow would be. That would be over in this far left area. Now, once I've determined that that's the furthest area from the light source, that's where my cast shadow is going to be. That will be your darkest area on your sketch or your drawing, that cast shadow. So what I like to do is I like to add that value first and work my way up to that darkest value of cast shadow. That gives me a reference to work on for the rest of the drawing. No area on the drawing will be darker than my cast shadow area. So once I have that value defined, I can work on everything from there, and everything needs to be lighter than the area that's in that cast shadow. So here I'm just using, I'm ranging from an HB all the way up to eventually an 8B. I use an HB, I use a 2B, 4B, and an 8B, all on this sketch. And I'm just continually adding more and more pressure and different types of pencils to this area to achieve the desired depth of value and tone that I want for the cast shadow. I just continually add darker and darker values and just gradually work that in. I don't try to speed through it. I'm just gradually working in darker tones and values. So I'm just continuing to layer on, getting that cast shadow to be a darker and darker value. And that will just help me to decide what the tones will be for the rest of the object. If you'll notice up in the top left-hand corner of your screen, I have already drawn in a cube up there that I was working on. And as you can see, the cast shadow. Once I define that, then I work towards finding the correct values for those other edges. So I'm just continuing to add more and more graphite here, darkening up that cast shadow area and really defining it. So as we talk about and discuss shape and volume and basic shapes, let's point out that virtually everything in the natural world can be simplified or grouped into essentially 4 basic 2D shapes: the square, triangle, circle, and rectangle. All other shapes can be constructed using these, but things get really interesting when we add a 3rd dimension to these shapes, thus creating the illusion of form in our drawings. A circle transforms into a sphere or cylinder, a triangle changes into a cone, and a square, like in this example, becomes a cube and can be stretched into a variety of cuboid shapes. So I'm just continuing to work on that cast shadow area here. Have you ever noticed how, as children, we're taught to draw everything with a hard outline on white paper with no background? I used to actually get in trouble because I wanted to fill in the backgrounds. But background tone is crucial to realistic drawing. It took me a long time as an adult to break the outlining habit. I did it though, and so can you. So later on in this drawing, as we add some background to it, let's keep that in mind. The dark tone of the background will always make the highlights stand out. You can let the darks create the lights in your drawing. This rule applies whether you are creating a simple shape like a square or something more complicated. As far as reflected light goes in drawing, reflected light is captured on an edge, a rim, or even the lip of an object. Go ahead and stop and look around at any object near you right now, especially if it's in bright light. Look for the edges along the sides, the top, or on the raised surfaces. Can you see the light along those edges? That's known as reflected light. If you look closely, even the darkest objects have some reflected light because typically they are slightly raised off of the surface that they're on. So I'm just continuing here to add more and more value to that cast shadow. I didn't really want to speed up any of this process because I wanted, for those who are extremely beginners, to be able to pick up on some of these techniques and really see the entire process from start to finish. And I'm continuing to add to that cast shadow just to determine what my darkest value is going to be for the rest of this sketch. Once I have that, I can move forward with all the other angular surfaces on this cube. Some things to keep in mind when we are drawing a cube. Drawing the cube is very different from drawing an egg shape or a spherical shape. Because of the flat surfaces, you will not really see the 5 elements of shading the same way. Rounded objects feature gradual transitions of value, and each flat surface on an angular object captures the light differently, making each side a different tone. Also, everywhere the surfaces meet, an edge is created, which means reflected light. Some of the steps of the process when you are creating as a cube is to create the line drawing, and begin with an outline of the basic cube. Then lightly shade around the hard edges where the surfaces meet. Then you want to place the dark tones like we talked about. Decide where the light source will be and place the darkest tones first. Since the cube surfaces are flat, the tones will not be as gradual as the spheres. Each plane's tones should be different, and the change will be more abrupt in your rounded objects. Later on in the drawing, you want to blend all of your tones. Remember to lift the reflected light off of each hard edge. You still apply the 5 elements of shading to angular objects. Your tonal changes are just more abrupt. Now here you can see I'm working on this side of the cube, and this side is known as our shadow edge. That means this is going to be the area on the object that is going to have the darkest tones. These tones will never be darker than your cast shadow, however. So that's why I started with the cast shadow. That tells me, okay, all the other tones that are on this shape need to be lighter than the cast shadow. So what I'm going to do here on this edge is I'm going to try to darken it as much as possible, but keeping that value lighter than the cast shadow value. And I continue to come in and just add graphite. And one thing that I have on this side that I didn't have in the cast shadow is I'm going to have reflected light. You'll notice along the bottom edge of this edge of the cube, it's going to be lighter than those halftones of the shadow edge, and it's going to be lighter than the cast shadow itself. It's going to be somewhere in between those values, and that will create the illusion that the light source is hitting the surface that the object is resting on and reflecting back up onto the object itself. That's where we get the term reflected light from. It's just that. It's light that's being reflected. So if you're wondering what those areas are that I'll leave lighter around the edges of that the darkest part of the shadow edge, those are going to be your reflected light edges. This is one of those exercises that you're going to want to practice repeatedly, do this over and over again. This sketch went a little longer, but typically you want to, make this sketch 10 to 20 minutes at the most, and you just practice over and over, just like our value scale. You practice drawing the cubes, spheres, cylinders, all of that, and practice does make progress. So this is just something you want to fill up pages in your sketchbook with, and it helps you become more familiar with these tones and these values, and just the exercise of drawing itself, as well as breaking these everyday objects down into these basic shapes. As you can see here, I'm using a 6B now, coming in to put those darkest values on my shadow edge, taking care to ensure that they never get as dark as the values in my cast shadow. And I just continue building up layers of that graphite to get it darker and darker. And I do take my time on this. That's one of the keys, is you don't rush it. It's always easier to add more graphite than it is to take graphite out. So you can always just come back in and continue to add more and more layers, darkening that up. And you'll notice I left the rest of this edge a little lighter so that I can compensate for my reflected light edges. Just continuing to work those values, darken it up as needed. I want to get it as dark as possible without matching the value of that cast shadow. That's the most important thing. Now I'm determining what value to use for my reflected light areas. I want it to be lighter than the cast shadow, lighter than the shadow edge, but not so light that it contrasts too much with either of those values. So I want to transition it somewhere in a mid-range between those two. So now I'm gradually adding value to the reflected light areas. And I'm defining that front corner a little more. It was starting to get lost there in some of those halftones. Now that I know where my shadow edge values are, as well as the cast shadow, I can come in and darken up those reflected light areas without making them too dark, making sure that the values still stand out next to those other tones. Now I'm using the HB here and very minimal pressure, and I'm just adding in some of the foundation shadows to the top edge. This is my brightest edge. It's in full view of the light source, so there is some shadow on there, but it's very minimal. So I'm just using an extremely light touch and this HB pencil to just lay down some very light tones on that top edge. And I felt like this corner edge here kind of got lost in between those two values, so I'm just adding a very light touch here just to kind of enhance that corner and make it stand out and pop just a little bit more. Not really outlining it here. As you'll see, I transition it into the surrounding shadows, but I do want to make sure that that edge is visible. Now as I begin to work on this edge is somewhere in between the shadow edge and that top edge. As you'll notice, this edge is not in full view of the light source, however, it's not completely obscured from the light source either. So these values on this side are going to need to be somewhere in between those other ranges. It's obviously not as light as that top surface, but it's certainly not as dark as the shadow edge. So that's why, as I had stated before, it's really important to come in there and do that cast shadow first, because that's going to be your darkest values, and then you know where to work from there. For example, I knew on my shadow edge it needed to be lighter than that cast shadow value, and once I had added that, now on this edge, which is going to be in between that edge fully exposed to the light source and the shadow edge, I know what tones and values to add to that to give it some contrast to the other values already in the sketch. And I just continue to shift between that HB pencil and that 2B pencil, possibly going as far as a 4B on this, but with a real light touch on the 4B. I'm just adding those different values and tones to this edge. And as you can see, where those two edges meet, the shadow edge and this edge here, there is going to be some reflected light there, so it's going to be a different value along that corner than either the shadow edge or the side that I'm working on here. It'll be a lighter value there to to help it stand out and give that three-dimensional illusion. Now here in this area I decided to add just a little cross hatching. Just wanted to give this edge a little more texture and just, try out some of these techniques that we've been learning. This is your time in your sketchbook when you're just doing these practice examples. Go ahead and try some hatching, try some of the circulism, try some cross hatching. Just try out those different techniques and see what works for you. And it can change the texture of it, it can change the tone of it, and it's just a fun experience. So there, I wanted to make sure that none of those edges were lost in the shading, and just went ahead and added a little value to them to help them pop. Continuing to do some very light cross hatching here. As you can see, I'm trying to blend out those lines, make them transition a little smoother. Just using the side of my pencil and adding gradual pressure as needed. Start with a very light touch at first and work my way up darker and darker. Once I feel completely comfortable with this edge and feel that it's finished, we'll go ahead and start to work on the background. Just defining that edge here so it doesn't get lost. Making sure that the change from one value to the next, that you can see the difference between the two. So now that I've finished that edge and I'm happy with it, I'm going to come in and we're going to start laying down some graphite as the basis for the background shadow and the background itself. One thing that we're going to keep in mind is that the areas of the object that are the lightest, in order to make those stand out and pop the most, we're going to really add some dark values to the background. The lighter the object, the darker the background. And on the flip side of that, if the object itself is dark, in those areas we're going to add a lighter background, such as around the cast shadow and on that far shadow edge. Those are our darkest areas on the object. So we're going to want to make sure to add a lighter background to those spots. So in this preliminary part of the process for this background, I'm just coming in with the HB pencil and laying down some very light pressure, very light tones, and just adding in those areas where there will be a background and defining those areas. And I kind of want to add a little interest and excitement, so I'm using different directions as I apply the shadows. I want those to stand out. I want there to be almost like the pencil marks and the directions are clearly distinct in the background. It does make for a little more visual interest in my opinion. And on here, like I said, all these are just practice. So we want to just try out all these different techniques. That's the main thing here, is just getting in some drawing time, getting in some practice time, getting that muscle memory of how our wrist, hand, and our shoulder moves and how our eye distinguishes the light source. So we just want to add different things here. As you can see, I'm just continuing to add more and more graphite, darkening up these areas for the background. And it may have looked like I was outlining the edges previously. I'm just adding in some darker value there, and then I take care to use pressure and really make those a smooth transition into the lighter values. I just really want to define those areas of darkest background. And once again, I'm making the areas of the darkest background against the areas of the object that are the lightest. Just continuing to add those values. Make nice smooth transitions. And keeping in mind also that I do not want any of these dark areas of the background to be darker than the cast shadow. That's still going to be the darkest part on the drawing. As we're getting close to wrapping this up, I do want to discuss how in the upcoming videos we will continue discussing shading and light, as well as creating 3D objects from two-dimensional shapes like we did today. We will also get into the concept of creating perspective and using vanishing points. Don't forget to stay tuned for the giveaway taking place at the end of the 10-part series. In order to enter, make sure you subscribe to the channel and post a comment under the 10th video in the series explaining one thing you learned from this series that helped you artistically. I will select one random comment to win a free kit of beginner's art supplies. So make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out. And here I'm just continuing to add value here, add some graphite. Really, I'm just trying to smooth out those transitions. Make them as well blended as possible as it goes from the darker areas to the lighter areas. Just continuing to vary my pressure, vary between pencils. Just really smooth those transitions out. Over here on this corner, I noticed that the two values, the object values and the background shadows, they were too similar, so I needed to define that edge a little more. Now I'm just using a 6B to come in and define the edge of the table or desk or whatever surface it is that this object is sitting on. Just using the side of the pencil and just sketching over that outline. Now I'm using an HB pencil, very light pressure, just adding a little value so that the surface isn't, completely the white of the paper. I do want to add a little value to that area. As always, I want to thank you for watching, and I look forward to our next session. And we're about to end for today. Go create something.